Debating death and memory, past and present. It's an archaeodeath debate.
Hey, Archaeodeathlings! In October of 2019, I was privileged to be a keynote speaker at the Free University of Brussels, talking at a conference on cremation practices. And this came shortly after, well, only a year after, a year and a half after, I published a book, Cremation and the Archaeology of Death. And so I thought, as part of my ongoing Archaeodeath YouTube presence, I would give a synopsis of that talk with the slides for my YouTube followers. Because this encapsulates quite a few different strands of my ongoing research over the last 25 years since my doctoral thesis, which looked at early Anglo-Saxon cremation practices. And I thought, therefore, this would be a useful chance to sort of show off some of that work and sort of encapsulate my passion for cremation. And so I called the paper The Cremation Sensation. And I made the point that actually a lot of the perception of cremation is downplayed in mortuary archaeology and studies of the history of death more generally. So Thomas W. Lacquer, in the Work of the Dead, A Cultural History of Mortal Remains, says there's been almost no changes in how the dead were burned from the earliest times into the 1870s, making obviously clear the point that the modern world and its cremation practices are different from those of prehistoric and early historic peoples. But, of course, in making that crude point, riding roughshod over the complex and varied stories of human life and death that we can reveal through the study of cremated human remains from the Paleolithic right up to the later Middle Ages and the early modern period in some parts of the world, as well as the ethnographic interactions of archaeology and ethnography from the 18th, 19th centuries, looking at non-Western traditional indigenous communities and their cremation practices, and then, of course, the archaeology of cremation in our world. And I want to sort of give you my point of my talk was to counter that stereotype, that view that before the modern world all cremation was the same. We use the word cremation, burning the dead, transforming the cadaver with by fire. It's all one homogeneous, universal, ahistorical, transhistorical phenomenon. And I suggested that there's four ways in which archaeologists can actually make important inroads into that conversation and change our traditional understanding of cremation practices. One, by actually excavating evidence of cremations in the human record, in the archaeological record of the human past. We can also make important contributions to the study of cremation in our societies of the 19th to 21st centuries. In doing so, one of the key challenges for us is not only how we excavate and improve our methods for investigation, but how we also display and envision cremated material. Do we treat it the same way as other human remains, or do we treat it differently? And if we do treat it differently, what rationales and what logics lie behind that? And another key area where I've been working on is not only looking at interpreting the archaeological record, not only looking at archaeology of the modern era and cremation in the modern era from an archaeological perspective, looking at spaces, material cultures, landscapes, architectures, not only looking at the debate surrounding the specific conditions and affordances of cremation in terms of human remains collections, displays, and the ways in which we communicate those stories, we envisage and describe them, but also how we imagine cremation. And here there's a lot of interaction between cremation in the archaeological record and our modern fantasies about cremation. Let's start off with the most obvious and traditional area, the study of the cremation practices in the human past. And it's true to say that over the last 30 to 35 years, human osteological studies of cremation practices, spearheaded by the work of Jackie McKinley and Julie Bond for Spong Hill in the early Anglo-Saxon period, and these are cremated material, cremation urns from Spong Hill. Here's a photograph from one of the excavation reports of an unemptied urn, and this is the laid out remains by Jackie McKinley of two individuals from the pots in which they were found, to make the point that actually, while seemingly and often discarded up into the mid to late 20th century as impossible to reconstruct, actually we can tell a lot of information from the cremated dead, not only aspects of, despite the fragmented, distorted, shrunken and transformed, fragmented remains that we have of the human body, we can still say often a lot of gain information about the age and sex of the individual, or in how many individuals. Sometimes we can say something about stature, or sometimes we can also say something about pathology. Also, the presence of animal remains in many of these urns, and artifacts, pyre goods and grave goods. They're all part of the story of the life of the person and their death rituals. And so cremation has been increasingly recognised, and for early Anglo-Saxon practices, not only the work of Jackie McKinley, but also the work of a whole series of other scholars like Kirsty Squires, Gareth Perry. We've seen more interesting and innovative work being done on cremation practices. One area where I've contributed towards this is in how we interpret the fragments of unburnt objects placed with the cremated dead, and how we theorise that by looking at parallels from anthropological theory and ethnographic evidence, but then exploring that through historical sources, and also then doing analyses of the relationship between age, sex, the pot and the grave goods and the pyre goods, to discern what particular selection choices were made about objects to be placed with the dead, and particularly those retrieved from the pyre or added subsequent to the pyre rite. So I won't go through all this here, but a lot of my back catalogue of research stemming from my doctoral thesis of 2000 is investigating these aspects of cremation ritual, how we can say something about past lives and past death rituals, and how cremation was conceptualised in different periods of time by looking at the patterns and processes at work in the archaeological record. This is the sort of what I've been spearheading in my research, standing on the shoulders and building from the work of others, osteologists, bioarchaeologists and other specialists who excavated and analysed these remains. Other aspects include how we think about urns and containers as transportable vessels for the containment of cremated remains, often taken for granted, and yet the selection choices and sometimes the deliberate decision to make, especially ceramic vessels or other kinds of material vessels, funerary containers for the cremated dead, it creates a very different relationship between the living and the dead, or can create a very different relationship between the living and the dead. And so the way in which we understand these vessels, the potentialities they offer for the transportation, the storage of the dead before their burial, or if ever they are buried beneath the ground, there's a lot of really rich potential for understanding cremation in the human past. And this again is a early 6th century vessel from Spong Hill in Norfolk, and an example of the period I was looking at for my doctoral research, looking at early Anglo-Saxon cremation practices in eastern England and southern England in the sort of the centuries immediately after the end of Roman Britain, and associated with the Anglo-Saxon migrations, pre-Christian, so sometimes called pagan, and the debates about how we interpret these remains centre on the vessels. And I've also put forward arguments about the significance of the shapes and forms of the vessels, building on the work of Julian D. Richards, but also the choice of combs and toilet implements. And previously I showed you a fragment of an antler comb, but also the choice of toilet implements of bronze and iron that were deliberately placed with the dead. And remember that the cremated dead, while they may have been treated on the pyre in perhaps a comparable way to the interment of the furnished burials of the same centuries in a grave unburnt, it involves an additional stage of rite of collecting up the remains and then at some later date interring them in the ground. And here this cluster from Spong Hill makes the point about how different age and sex individuals, the letters annotate age: adult, A for adult, old mature adult, juvenile, a female, younger mature adult, a mature adult male, different individuals, perhaps family groups or other kinds of household groups that are interred together. So there's almost a sense of sociality or intimate association that you don't get with inhumation graves with the choice to cremate the dead. So there's a whole series of different ways in which cremation creates relationships between the living and the dead, but also relationships among the dead in a burial plot that isn't replicable in other disposal methods. So my research looked at that, including choices of how to protect and contain the dead, sometimes with lids. And in one exceptional case, although not found on a cinerary urn, found in the cemetery at Spong Hill, we have this chairperson, the Spong Hill chairperson, who I've crudely redrawn to emphasise the fact that there is various asymmetries to this individual, including a one eye factor. It looks like one of the eyes has actually been gouged out at some point, which mirrors other deliberate blindings of objects that we find from the middle to late first millennium AD across Scandinavia and Northern Europe, that Paul Mortimer and Neil Price, for example, have seen as potentially associated with the cult of Odin. I wouldn't go quite so far with this, but it's part of a broader phenomenon I've identified of re-embodying the dead in the cremation urn, and the urn is almost an animate presence, and perhaps these. Not only this exceptional case of a lid that has been given a seated figure, sort of a protective, perhaps, or animated force in the grave, but also putting grave houses over the dead is another way in which you're almost giving an animated presence for the dead in a cemetery in the landscape. So a more recent piece of work I've looked at these 4 and 5 post structures with Katie Myers-Emery. We did a paper in the Archaeological Journal looking at rethinking these 4 or 5 post structures, and here the Apple Down Cemetery, and Katie's reconstruction of how perhaps we should think of them less as grave markers or mortuary houses, as perhaps almost like micro columbaria for above ground storage of the cremated dead. And this is the range of sites where we have examples of them. And this has led me also into comparative analysis of how we look at cremation in other parts of Northern and Western Europe and Scandinavia and Finland in the mid to late first millennium AD, as about different strategies of transforming the dead, commemorating the dead, and integrating the dead into the landscape. And the parallels with Anna Westman's work in Finland, looking at the cremation cemeteries under level ground, is one area of publication where I've explored the different types of memory at work in the burning of the body and the transformation, the integration of those ashes with bones into cemetery spaces. Another piece of work I've been involved with looked at, this is in the Oxford Handbook for the Archaeology of Death and Burial, I looked at another example being the Thor hammer rings, these iron rings from central Sweden, which in the late Viking Age are placed with the cremated dead, and I make a new interpretation of what these various tools and implements are. And I say they're nothing necessarily to do with Thor, but perhaps to do with other aspects of regeneration and transformation linked to metalworking. And other aspects of cremation is that cremation is not counter-monumental. A lot of people see cremation, they think, well, it often leaves very scant traces, but actually we can see cremation is part of, in some cases, the most elaborate funerary rituals that we have for any period or region. So here, the late 6th, early 7th century princely burials that we have most famously know about through Sutton Hoo, Taplow, Prittlewell, Broomfield. Another example, one of the examples of them is Astle in Oxfordshire, where the excavations in the early 20th century by E.T. Leeds revealed a part of a Byzantine and Frankish imported metalwork, pottery, bronze vessels, part of a poorly understood and fragmentary excavation of this burial, isolated barrow burial, but showing that a substantial mound can be associated with elite ritual practices involving the cremation of the dead. So cremation is not the poor man's rite or the poor person's rite. It can be an elaborate theatrical display. And remember, for the Sutton Hoo Cemetery, our only princely cemetery of more than one burial that we have, most of the burials excavated produced evidence of cremation ritual, not ship burial, which only took place in 2 cases, and an inhumation with a horse and a female inhumation in one other case. So we have at least 4 inhumations from Sutton Hoo, but we have many more cremations. And we have to remember, therefore, cremation seems to be part of this elite theatre of death, associated with the late 6th, early 7th century, at least in part related to kingdom formation and stress and times of social reorganisation and political reorganisation and religious reorganisation as Christian missionaries appear on the scene, although before formal Christian conversion. So we see cremation as part of that story. And here in this particular location, mapped across the river Windrush, and there's the Thames. The Barrow Astor would have dominated Akeman Street and the Windrush Valley, and have been a dominant feature in that North Oxfordshire landscape west of Whitney and Minster Lovel. And so when we get to Sutton Hoo, the most famous of early Anglo-Saxon cremation cemeteries, we can see this monumental barrow burial is all about not imposing the dead in elaborate ships for afterlife journeys. That only happens in two cases. It's the spine of the rituals in mounds 3, 4, 18, 7, 6, 5, and perhaps also the others, I suspect, is the cremation, the burning of the dead. So a lot of my work has been looking at how we interpret cremation as actually more important and significant for understanding early Anglo-Saxon England, or the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, or the early Anglo-Saxon period, than we previously appreciated. Cremation has also played a role in my understanding of in field work at multiple Bronze Age sites that I've been involved with, and most recently the Pillar of Elliseg, just north of in the Vale of Llangollen, in the Sine Valley of the Nantygluiseg. We have a prehistoric burial mound capped by what is now the fragments of a cross shaft of 9th century date reinserted into its original base. What you see there is a construction of the 18th century, but on an earlier mound, which our excavations with Bangor University and the University of Chester were able to confirm that we're looking at an early Bronze Age burial mound that after 3,000 years or so of being in the landscape was reused by Christian cross. Now what's really interesting about this from a cremation perspective is that we found kists, including one disturbed cremation kist and one intact cremation kist, in our excavations on the the western side of the monument. And we also produced evidence of one of North Wales's largest cremation deposit with a bone pin and a flint blade. So we do have this evidence of a cremation practices in the Bronze Age, but then 3,000 years later, an early medieval reuse of the site as a Christian focus of perhaps of ritual and liturgy, perhaps also commemoration of the Powisian royal family. The cross shaft is inscribed with the early medieval Britain's longest monumental Latin text, commemorating the great grandfather of the contemporary ruler Cyngan, Elliseg. So we have, or Elise. So we have this this genealogical relationship of the cross and commemoration, but the cremated material may have actually been discovered, at least in part, in the early Middle Ages, and so this cremated material had a significance in the Bronze Age that we can only partially reconstruct, but then it also has a new lease of life, perhaps being turfed over and uncovered, affirming to early medieval Welsh people that this was a funerary monument. So here's some of my literature if you want to follow it up, looking at cremation in the early Middle Ages or cremation in the early medieval past, some of the more recent pieces where I've tried to interpret the grave goods, the landscape, the monuments of cremation, and explore the variety to get away from Leclerc's opening dismissal that cremation is just a uniform funerary ritual. A lot of my work has also been looking at cremation present, looking at the architectures, landscapes and material cultures of modern cremation as they've emerged. Now, archaeologies of the contemporary world and of the industrial and post-industrial landscapes we inhabit is hardly a new thing now, and we see a rich subdiscipline of industrial archaeology and contemporary archaeology, or post-medieval archaeology more broadly, in which we can approach the archaeology of us, the material culture of ourselves, and yet from Shelley's cremation on a beach through to a modern crematorium, ancient ideas of cremation percolate through the way we conceptualise the cremated dead today. And for that reason, and also because there's the cremated dead in our society populate everywhere, from the gardens of remembrance of a crematorium itself, to burial plots of ledgers and low grave markers, in cemeteries associated closely with inhumation graves, as well as the broader landscape. These are some flowers left at Hay Tor in Devon. And also in churchyards. And so for part of my work has been not only exploring cremation past, but also looking at cremation in the present, the different material cultures and architecture spaces and landscape contexts where cremation burial finds a new meaning within traditional sacred and social spaces. This is a view from the church tower at Stokenham in Devon of the traditional cremation plot, nearly full. And I've involved in churchyard surveys in Devon and elsewhere, exploring the different material presences of cremation. And here's some more examples for you. 2 cremation patches at Chirk in Wrexham, the east end of the church, huddled up against the main building. And then a larger field of ledgers away from the church. And the variety of these is something I've published on recently, looking at the variety of ways in which churchyards and church extensions find ways in which the cremated dead are integrated. Often, obviously, because interment doesn't involve digging down 6 feet, you can actually bury the cremated dead in older parts of cemeteries, overlying older graves along pathways by walls and churchyard walls. And I've also explored the material cultures and illusions associated with gardens of remembrance in Sweden, where there's a different relationship with cremation, largely secular nation, but where the Church of Sweden still controls death and the dead, and gardens of remembrance with architectures involving water, stone, flowers, lanterns, candles, and lawns. These Minneslund, these memory groves, these gardens of remembrance, are a distinctive feature of cremation in the contemporary historic churchyard. And some of them do evoke prehistoric motifs and themes, such as this micro-megalithic arrangement of a Minneslund, with the word Minneslund written on it, from Hageby Höger in Östergötland. And here, where the reuse of the central feature with the water feature is a 19th century iron gravestone, and then 2 iron gravestones flank the back of a building adjacent to this garden of remembrance. So a bit of the old graveyard is reused as a garden of remembrance, and old iron crosses are stationed, repurposed, to give a new meaning within those spaces. And sometimes these spaces also include overt heritage references. So here we see the garden of remembrance with a bench and lanterns and flowers, and this is the lawn where ashes are scattered, and there are 3 late 10th or early 11th, mid 11th century rune stones situated and on display with their heritage labels as part of the churchyard complex. So all of these spatial and material dimensions, the connections between the present and the past, are all part of how we can approach cremation's materialities, both looking into prehistory and early history, but also looking into our contemporary landscapes. And this really interesting one, the famous Ringerike weather vane from Schalingo in Gotland, is replicated on top of a cross associated with a garden of remembrance that resembles an Iron Age barrow. So there's all sorts of allusions to the proto-history of Gotland and Christianity mashed up in this locally designed garden of remembrance. And at Matala Cemetery in Östergötland, I actually came across modern cremation plots arranged to appear like an Iron Age grave field, and a Viking period or Bronze Age and Viking period ship setting, with each individual stone here marked with a plaque, and Ashlund or Ashgrove marked on the end of the prow of the ship. And at Mjolby Cemetery in Östergötland, a rune stone, a modern rune stone, but giving that sense aura of antiquity, is placed at the centre of where your flower holders are within the garden of remembrance. There's all these ways in which allusions to the past and ways in which we aesthetically, emotionally, symbolically engage with cremation find a place in our cemeteries and churchyards. and most recently I've looked at the Helsinki cemetery of Hietaniemi. I can never say that right. Hietaniemi, where cremation finds a whole range from the 19th century through to the 21st century of material manifestations in terms of large family tombs, motifs and symbolism, through to columbaria and smaller gravestones and circular and other complex arrangements, towers and pillars, low cobbles and Christian crosses. So a whole rich range of ways in which cremation creates opportunities for new kinds of architecture and new kinds of memorialisation. Now, another area of which I've looked at the archaeology of the contemporary past is to go beyond cemeteries and churchyards and crematoria and actually look at other kinds of landscapes that have become associated with the cremated human dead. A good example of that is Chester Zoo, where there are not only memorials to workers and to founders, but there is also a memory tree where you can sponsor to have a plaque and a memorial name, and many animals have the names of individuals who have died and some of whose ashes are scattered within the cemetery. Another example I've looked at is the Donkey Sanctuary at Sidmouth in Devon, another whole charitable landscape of donkey rescue framed around as a landscape of ash scattering and memorialisation for donkeys, pets and visiting humans. So it's a landscape that meshes together human and animal identities, and cremation is part of that ability to give the new kinds of landscape meaning. So here's all the memorials from the Donkey Sanctuary to give you, or some of the memorials to give you a sense on the stable blocks themselves, and also in a special garden of remembrance, and in the various walks around the paddocks, commemorating famous donkeys that are sort of in the early years of the sanctuary, through to articulating relationships between loved donkeys individually or collectively and dead human beings. So here's a second bibliography of some of my work on contemporary cremation. So as well as looking at cremation in the human past, focusing particularly on Early Anglo-Saxon, Viking Age, Scandinavia, I've also been looking at cremation in the present, how we can look at the emotions, mnemonics and materialities and the relationship between those things, those ideas and concepts in an understanding cremation in our world. And moving on to that is more sort of heritage and museological issues of how we display and envision cremation. And here I've made through my blog and also through publications, and I've talked about this in a previous video, I've addressed how we display and interpret cremated human material within heritage sites and open air ones and actual visitor centres and so on. So for example, for Stonehenge, I have critiqued the fact that the cremated dead, the dead of Stonehenge, the people who may have been instrumental in its creation and recreation, are only represented by a stark small handful of cremated bones, giving no indication to visitors of what the kind of multiple stage ceremonies and the evocation of architecture and landscape and materiality associated with burning corpses, and then the collection of those remains and their internment associated with the bluestone. So making the point that we sanitize the cremation process into sort of inert material when actually it was a lot more complex. And another example of this is the Newgrange in the Boyne Valley of Ireland in County Meath, where you have cremated remains cleaned and white, given a similar comparable, almost artistic display, one which is beautiful but also makes us wonder what do people understand about cremation that we're being seen as portrayed in these museum contexts. And of course the cremated dead from the past populate our landscapes, both in terms of ancient burial mounds, such as here the Cursus Barrows and then the King Barrow Ridge behind, above, and then the Overton Barrow group to the southeast of Avebury, just to make the point that while inhumation was also a factor, a lot of the story of these mounds is tied up with cremation ceremonies. But also we have them in our museums. We have this is Facilis's gravestone from Colchester with the lead canister in which his remains were recovered. and we have other ways in which we can display the dead, both indoors and outdoors, in innovative ways. So here at Hudderslev, you have a grave field where the chronological development of the individual circles of the graves can be seen over time, and they've mapped out the pots associated with the cremations from each of those phases. To make the point that we can see the evolution of communities over time. This display at the National Historical Museum in Stockholm is particularly evocative for me because they didn't actually put cremated human remains on display, but used silhouettes to evoke the presence of the dead, which I think is very interesting. I'm not saying that's the only way we should do it, but it actually does bypass the need to use human remains as the primary mechanism. Through to the replica pillar of Elizeg in Llangollen Museum, a small voluntary run museum, and I've reflected on how our excavations from 2010 to 2012 with Project Elizeg actually fostered the creation of this modest display of a burial kist of the early Bronze Age in relation to the early Christian monument, telling you something of that relationship of past and present that you can't get at the site itself. Now, cremation is not only about the human past, about our recent past, and about how we curate, display, envisage, interpret. It's also about the fact that this is now widespread in popular culture. This is Sir Frank Dix's Funeral of a Viking, but with Dr. Aaron Watson, I've been busy as part of my research on cremation, looking at new ways we can perhaps visualise cremation practices. There are multiple stages and multiple sequences. This is Victor Ambros's drawing from Sutton Hoo of a burial of a vessel, but here's two pieces of art created digitally by Aaron Watson, showing a body being burnt, and then and mourners around at night, and then during daytime the collection of artefacts from the pyre by multiple mourners. And part of our public engagement is that these ephemeral monuments and these ephemeral features can be evocative ways of engaging people. We shouldn't dismiss them and celebrate just the monumental. And McGregor and Brophy's Build and Burn project shows that very well, not specifically looking exclusively at cremation, but looking more broadly at the different ways in which we can incorporate cremation into public engagement. And I think that there's a whole series of ongoing debates that need to be addressed about how we engage communities in cremation practices in the past. Do we stylise, romanticise it, or do we talk about its complexity, its variability, and the changes over time? And this links to cremations imagined, my fourth area of research, because as well as the experience of other that is experienced through cremation in our world, where the Balinese, the Nepalese, other parts of the world where open air cremation takes place, a lot of our imagination has to sift through historical sources to understand the complex rites. This is the cover of one of my favourite book covers, from Burial and Society, Klaus Hjelt Jensen and Karen Hoyland Nielsen, put together in 1997 from Aarhus University Press, and it's a cartoon version of the funeral of Ibn Fadlan, with Ibn Fadlan looking on at the Rus Viking boat cremation on the banks of the Volga, we're drawn into the story of the different elements or aspects of it, that have been of what this funeral is about. And yet, of course, this is already taken out of our hands, because many of our TV shows increasingly are visualising cremation in the human past, such as the historic drama Vikings, which I talk about in another video, and Game of Thrones, which, although I still got 2 seasons to go, I never got around to finishing it. Whether I know there's more cremation, but cremation is the primary mode of disposal for Westeros, or at least for parts of Westeros. So we have cremations in abundance on water, mass cremation, individual cremation, as a mode of transformation. The Walking Dead. Now, no matter how implausible the cremations are, the cremation sets up in the storyline perceptions of how we understand ourselves, our identities, and our mortality, and I've talked about that in another video. Another good sci-fi example is through the sequels of Star Wars, the Death Mask, or it was his actual mask of Anakin Skywalker, of Darth Vader, becomes a kind of memorial and almost like a relic for Kylo Ren to worship at, to gain inspiration, but also dread from this twisted carapace. And to just give you an example of some recent outputs, two papers, one with Ali Cleverness in the book called Vikings and the Vikings, one also in a book, The Public Archaeology of Death. I look at Death's drama, looking at Vikings seasons 1 to 4. And all of this comes together in a book I've recently produced with Jessica Serezzo-Roman and Anna Vestman on cremation and the archaeology of death. So there's lots of ways you can read up about my take on how we approach cremation, why we should approach cremation, such an important aspect of funerary archaeology. Well, that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through my work on cremation practices to show you how mortuary archaeologists are conducting a very special subdiscipline of archaeology that has so many connections to the rest of archaeology, but has its specific concerns about ethics, popular culture, politics, and the careful interpretation of presence and absence from the sometimes scintillating, sometimes frustrating remains we have of past cremation rituals from prehistory and the early medieval period, but also how we can look at ourselves and the evolution of modern architectures, landscapes, material cultures of cremation in the 19th, 20th and 21st centuries. So there's lots of ways we can do further research on this, and I don't want to claim to have a monopoly on it, but I hope in short that gives you a sort of a flavour of some of the key points of my keynote from a year and a bit ago. I'm very honoured to be there and to be part of that broader debate, and I learned a lot from the other speakers who are doing ongoing exciting stable isotope work, scientific work on cremation practices, micromorphological work, as well as trying to address the broader archaeological issues. So lockdowns changed time and everything, and I wasn't doing a video channel at that point when I gave that paper, so I hope this short video gives you a sort of a sense of my past work, and I've got a few things coming out moving forward, including a co-edited book with Femke Lippock of Leiden University on cremation in the early Middle Ages. So we're in the process of creating that a new book. So look out for that in late 2021 or early 2022.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on WordPress, or you'll never learn.